Good evening. Wonderful to be with you. Sylvia, thank you. Let me take, if I may, a moment to salute Sylvia and Puentes Cubanos, Cambio Cubano, all the groups that are co-sponsors of this Second National Summit on Cuba, Florida. I know, and my colleagues standing across from me in the media know, that most, if not all of you attending this are not newcomers to the issue of Cuba. On a piece that appeared a short time ago on Channel 10, General Sheehan responded to that, in fact, as he had eloquently this morning. And I know, as indeed my brothers and sisters in the press know, that your discussion here this second year is an important, I would even say, a critical part of the dialogue that is going to help formulate U.S.-Cuba policy in the future. First, let me say on each of the tables, as there was earlier, there are pads of paper and pencils, and I know that every one of you has a question for President Gorbachev. I know that as we had dinner, we all had questions, and our conversation was fascinating. It is a privilege for me to introduce Mikhail Gorbachev this evening. About 5 years ago in Miami, he came to speak to WITZO, the Women's International Zionist Organization. I had the privilege of introducing him then. We are all affected by history. Very few of us change history. Mikhail Gorbachev changed history. Without him, the Cold War would not have ended, I think. He put a human face on communism. He taught the West and entered into our lexicon perestroika and glasnost. I'd like to say this conference is a welcome blast of glasnost in our community. One of my memorable conversations with one of my heroes, the late Congressman Dante Fascell of Miami, was about Mikhail Gorbachev. When he was the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, he returned from, I think, his first visit to Moscow to meet with Mr. Gorbachev. And Dante, if you knew him in his own exuberant way, he said, "Mike, this is a great guy, a great guy." I said to Gorby one time, I said, "Gorby, you're just doing the right thing." And the seal of approval from Dante Fascell, Mr. President, was good enough for me. When Mr. Gorbachev resigned in 1991, he said in his resignation speech this: "The country received freedom, was liberated politically and spiritually, and that's the most important achievement." Perhaps this evening, Mr. President, you can give us, Washington and Havana, and our community a blueprint for Cuba achieving its freedom. Please welcome Mikhail Gorbachev.
Я должен удостовериться, мой неизменный помощник и спутник Павел Палащенко на месте или нет?
I have to be sure whether my assistant, my advisor, Pavel Palashenko, whether he is here for the translation.
Но я рядом всегда имею несколько человек, которые знают
I
английский,
have a number of people always with me
чтобы
who
осуществлять принцип президента
English.
Рейгана: доверяй, но проверяй.
and that is in order to be sure, like President Reagan said, trust but verify.
Добрый вечер, уважаемые участники саммита.
Good evening, The
саммита
summit
исключительно
on Cuba, the
интересную
National
и
Summit on Cuba, is
беспрецедентную.
an extremely interesting and
То, что он
unique
зародился
event, and the fact
действует,
that this
и
summit is
генерирует
taking
идеи,
place for a
ставит
second
вопросы
time,
перед
that
своей
it is
нацией,
generating ideas, that it
приглашает
is
для консультаций,
raising
для
issues, that it is
дискуссий
inviting
по
for
этим
consultation and
животрепещущим, живым
discussion
вопросам.
on these
Это
very
говорит о
important,
том,
urgent
что
issues.
все-таки в мире происходят
Various
перемены.
people, I think that
И, как
that is
сказал
another sign of change
Мой старый
in
знакомый,
the
открывая
world,
эту
and as
конференцию, что саммит это свидетельство
was
того,
said
что
at the beginning,
гласность пришла в Америку.
summit may be an example of glasnost in America.
Я считал, что в Америке все-таки
Well,
гласность
I
есть.
always thought that in America there is a lot of glasnost.
Я недавно написал
I
статью в
have
итальянскую газету.
recently written an article that was published in
Я
an
заглавил,
Italian
она
newspaper,
касалась
and
Америки.
that
Я
article
озаглавил ее,
was about
Что
America.
Америке нужна своя
And
перестройка.
it said America needs its own perestroika.
И это с большим я смыслом говорю.
And this is something I believe.
Акцент здесь на
The
слове
emphasis here
«своя».
is its
Не
own.
наша. Нам своя
It's not
перестройка, а Америке есть
just
своя перестройка.
perestroika,
Потому что
not
мир
our
меняется.
perestroika, it's
Мир
your
меняется.
perestroika. That is
Мы
to say,
меняемся.
responding to change in the
И
world.
самое
The world is
большое
changing, and we
противоречие
too must
состоит в
change.
том,
And the biggest
что
conflict, the
реальные
biggest
события и процессы
contradiction is that
обгоняют
the
политику.
developments
Политика отстает.
in the world are
Она буксует.
outpacing politics.
Она допускает
Politics is
просчеты.
lagging behind
И в
the
результате мы
events.
очень сильно
Too many mistakes are
страдаем
being
этого и
made,
расплачиваемся.
and we have to pay the price
Это
for
побудило меня
those mistakes. That is
вместе с
why
многими представителями в обществе
recently,
Соединенных Штатов
together
Америки
with a number of
в мае
political leaders
месяце
last May,
учредить
I
на учредительной конференции
created
форум мировой
the
политики.
World Political
Для
Forum. The
обсуждения
World Political Forum, whose
мировых
goal
процессов
is to
И роли политики
discuss
в нынешнем
global
глобальном
developments and the
мире,
role
в
of
котором мы начинаем
politics and
начали
policymakers
жить
in a
и
global
учимся
world in
тому,
which
как
we
жить
are
и вести
living,
дела,
in which we
как
are
управлять
learning
делами.
to live, and which we are learning to manage.
И, конечно, мы должны не
And of
оставлять
course,
без внимания
we have to,
те вопросы, те конфликты, те
we cannot
проблемы,
ignore those
которые идут
problems, those
прошлого,
issues, those
связанные с
conflicts that
холодной
we
войной,
inherited from the past,
с той
that we
конфронтацией,
inherited from the Cold War, that we inherited from the confrontation
в которой мы жили.
in which we
Десятилетия.
lived for decades.
И среди них есть такие
Among
вопросы,
those
которые имеют
Issues
особое
are
значение.
issues of particular importance.
Я бы назвал прежде всего
I would in
ситуацию на
particular
Ближнем Востоке.
mention the situation in the
Этот
Middle
конфликт,
East, the conflict
несмотря на мирный
which,
процесс, который мы открыли
despite the
с
peace
президентом
process
Бушем,
that President Bush
Мадриде в
and I
91 году,
inaugurated in Madrid in
этот мирный
1991,
процесс прошел
this
какой-то этап,
peace process,
какие-то
after
сформировались
some
представления,
initial
подходы,
steps,
и тем не менее
after
он буксует
developing its
и
first
приносит
successes, is
много
now
беды в этом
stalling,
регионе,
and
да и в мировой политике.
the result of that
Я думаю, что
slowdown
и
is
одним из
a lot of tragedies
конфликтов,
in that region
который
and beyond it.
из прошлого идет,
One of the
или
conflicts
конфликтная
that
ситуация,
is
назовем ее,
the legacy
то,
of the past,
что связано
or let us put it this way,
блокадой
a
Кубы.
conflict situation that we inherited from the past is all that
Очень непростой вопрос.
relates to the Cuban embargo, all
И сейчас
that
я
relates to the blockade of
кое-что
Cuba. This is not an easy
сказать
issue,
из истории.
and I would like first to talk
наших
about first of all, to talk about some historical background.
Руководители Советского Союза
Historical
и
background, I would like to recall some
Соединенных Штатов
discussions
Америки
that I, as
связи
the
с этой
Soviet leader and the United States leaders
Я
had
уже,
on
будучи
this
у вас
problem.
несколько раз, должен был всегда
Here,
ожидать,
in
что
this
мне
city,
здесь будут
in
во
this
Флориде
city,
задавать вопрос,
which I have
что я
visited
думаю о
on several occasions,
американско-кубинских
I
отношениях
was
и
often
ситуации.
asked what I thought
Так всегда было.
about Cuban-U.S. relations and
Я хочу вас
about the current
вернуть
situation.
К концу
So let me first go
1989
to the
года.
historical background.
У меня была встреча на
and that
Мальте
is 1989, December
Президентом Соединенных Штатов.
1989, when I first
Она
had a
знаменита
meeting
тем, что
in
именно
Malta
тогда
with President
протянув
George Bush.
через стол друг
It
другу
was on that
руки,
occasion
мы
that
объявили,
we
что отныне
shook hands
не считаем
and
себя
announced
противниками.
that we no longer regard
Это было, по сути,
our countries as enemies.
актом
This was
прекращения холодной войны,
the
символическим актом
statement
прекращения
of the end
холодной
of
войны.
the Cold
Там, на
War.
Мальте
It
это было.
was the symbolic end of the Cold War.
И вот перед началом разговоров президент
Before the
попросил
beginning of our
поговорить один на один.
negotiations, the president asked
И мы
me
уединились.
to
Присутствовали
have a
только
one-on-one talk, and so we
генерал
went
Сколокров
to a
и мой
separate
помощник
room,
по
and
международным делам.
we talked in the presence of just two
Тогда
persons,
шла
General Scowcroft and
гражданская война в
my
Никарагуа и Сальвадоре.
international affairs advisor. At that time,
Мы, Советский Союз и
the
американцы,
civil war in Nicaragua and in
поддерживали
El Salvador
противоположные стороны.
was still on, and the Americans
И вот
and
тогда мы
we
договорились
supported
прекратить
different
поставки
sides.
оружия
At that time,
в контексте,
we
так
agreed
сказать,
that we
отказа
would
от холодной
stop
войны между
arms
нами
supplies.
самими.
We would stop arms supplies because our own Cold War had ended, so
И
we
Джордж Буш
would
поставил
do so.
вопрос о Кубе.
And in that same conversation, George Bush
Зачем она вам,
talked to me
говорил он мне,
about Cuba.
вы тратите на
He
нее
asked me,
6 миллиардов в год.
What do you need Cuba for? You are spending
Деньги вам
$6 billion
самим нужны
a year for Cuba.
для
You need
реформы у
that
себя
money.
дома.
You need that money for reforms in your own country.
Фидель Кастро вам отвечает
And
тем, что ругает и
Fidel
вас, и вашу
Castro is
перестройку.
actually criticizing you. He is criticizing
А ваша
perestroika.
помощь и вообще ваша
And
позиция в
your
вопросе о Кубе
assistance, he said, your position
служит
on Cuba
раздражающим
are
фактором
an
в
irritant
отношении
for the
американцев
American
к
people,
Советскому Союзу.
an irritant in the attitude of the American people toward the Soviet Union.
Я ответил, что, во-первых,
I answered
мы
that,
помогали и
first of all,
помогаем,
we
потому что
helped
вы
Cuba,
устроили
we continue
блокаду
to
острова.
help Cuba because of the embargo.
А людям там надо как-то жить.
People need to survive there, so that's
Во-вторых,
why we're helping.
Куба
Secondly,
компенсирует нашу помощь
said,
поставками
Cuba
необходимых нам товаров.
Is making up for
Сахар,
our
цитрусовый,
assistance by the
никель и другое
supplies
сырье.
of products such as sugar, citrus, fruit,
Конечно, это не
nickel,
покрывает
and
наших
some other
расходов.
raw materials. Of course, this is
Поэтому мы
less
называем это
than what
помощью.
we spend, but that's why we call it assistance. That's why we call it aid.
В-третьих, мы начали
Thirdly, I
пересматривать свои
said we have
экономические связи
begun
с Кубой,
to reconsider
как и со странами
our
Восточной
economic relations with
Европы,
Cuba
с
and
третьим
also
миром.
with the countries of
Переводим их
Eastern Europe
постепенно на
and with the
коммерческую
Third
основу.
World. We are gradually putting them on a regular
А
commerce
в-четвертых, и самое
basis.
главное,
And thirdly, and the most important thing, I said,
вы, Джордж, неправильно оцениваете
You
наши
are
политические отношения с Кубой.
misinterpreting our political relationship with Cuba.
Фидель Кастро не
I said
является нашей
Fidel
марионеткой.
Castro is
И
not
никогда ею
our
не был.
puppet. He never was a puppet.
Он абсолютно суверенная
He is a
самостоятельная
sovereign,
политическая
he is a sovereign
фигура.
and independent political
Никаких указаний
figure.
ни у кого из моих предшественников,
And
не
he
говоря уже
has
обо мне, он не получал.
never
Да и отверг бы их.
asked for any directions from me or from my
В зависимости
predecessors,
его от нас,
and
сугубо-
he would
сугубо
reject
экономически.
any directions from
В
us.
условиях жестокого
Our
эмбарго народ живет
Relationship
впроголодь,
and his dependence on us
и
is
Кастро
purely
вынужден брать там,
economic.
где дают.
As a result of the embargo,
И кроме того,
people
конечно,
do not
специфика
have
наших
enough to
связей
eat, and
диктовала
therefore
до сих
Castro
пор
takes
логикой
where he
холодной
can.
войны.
And of course, I said, our relationship was mostly dictated by the
Джордж Буш
logic
согласился
of the
с
Cold
тем, что
War.
Кастро действительно
George Bush
теперь не
agreed
марионетка, раз
that
он
Castro was
отказался
no longer a
идти в
puppet.
ногу с курсом, принятым в СССР.
After all, he refused to go the
Я
same
поделился с
course, to
президентом
accept the same course as
своими
the
впечатлениями от своего
USSR.
недавнего визита на
I also
Кубу.
shared
Когда
with the
это
president
состоялось.
impressions from
А
my
именно, мне
visit to
показалось,
Cuba
что Фидель склонен
a few
искать
months
пути
before.
нормализации
My
с
impression was
Соединенными
that
Штатами.
Fidel was inclined to
Он
look
понимает, что
for
мир
a way
сильно
to
меняется, и
normalize
что ему
relations
тоже
with the
надо
United
меняться.
States. He understood that the world was changing and that he too
Президент
had to change.
обещал подумать,
President Bush
но
promised that
опять
he
и
would
опять ссылался,
think about it,
цитирую,
but again
на
he
мощное
said, and I quote,
эмоциональное
that there
неприятие
is
этого диктатора
a
со
great
стороны огромной
emotional
кубинской
rejection of
миграции
this
на юге
dictator on the part of the Cuban community in southern Florida.
Флориды. Мой сигнал, в общем, не имел
So my signal, after all, was not pursued.
но очень важен
But
контекст,
it is very
в котором
important
состоялся
to recall
наш
the
разговор
context
о
in which that conversation between me and the US President took place.
Контекст окончания
The
холодной
context
войны.
was the end of the Cold War.
Кстати, Соединенные Штаты
And of course, the
нормализовали
United
отношения с
States
Китаем,
had normalized its relationship with
с
China, with
восточноевропейскими
Vietnam,
государствами.
with
В
the
общем, со
Eastern
всеми,
European
кто так
states,
или иначе был
with all of
втянут
those
в
who
круговорот
were
мировой конфронтации.
involved in that great confrontation, but Cuba remained
Я понимаю, Куба для США
a problem for the United
и тем не
States.
менее.
I understand that Cuba for the United States is a special case, but certainly the time has come after 40 years to change things.
Представляет собой
I cannot
национальной
accept
безопасности
that
Соединенных Штатов.
Cuba today would be a threat to US national security.
Наше Министерство обороны
And actually,
признало это по своей
the
линии еще в
US Department of Defense recognized in 1991
Кубинская проблема
that Cuba was no threat to the United States.
холодной войной.
The Cuban
Но в
problem,
отличие от других
as an
стран,
international problem, was the result of the Cold War. But unlike other countries involved in US-Soviet confrontation, Cuba was a special case.
к советскому блоку.
We did not
И революция
incorporate Cuba to the Soviet bloc by force. The revolution there happened without us. It was not led by communists. Initially, they rejected any alliance with the Communist Party of Cuba.
романтически настроенных молодых
It was a revolution of young members of the intelligentsia who were able to fire up the people, who were resentful of one of the worst dictatorships of that time. And the revolution won relatively easily because the grapes of wrath against Batista were ripe among the people. Some people in America did not like it. Let us not go into the detail, but anyway, the diplomatic relationship was broken off, and the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. That invasion was defeated, but the hostility that emerged after the revolution became permanent after the Bay of Pigs.
поддержав эту акцию,
By supporting that action,
Соединенные Штаты Америки
the United States of America took a certain stand.
и хотя
And after that, we have seen 9 presidents of the United States. The situation remains, and the attitude remains the same as at the height of the Cold War. There was a real threat to the independence of the country, and therefore the Cuban government started to look for support. And that was natural because it was facing a superpower. A small island republic was facing a superpower. And with the Cold War raging, the choice was obvious. And as soon as that choice was made, Cuba became a part of a global confrontation. I would say that it was caught in a global confrontation of the Cold War. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba came close to becoming a trigger for the nuclear war. And as part of the blockade situation and the ideological belonging to the socialist camp, it was inevitable that Cuba chose that particular economic and political path. In order to solidify links with the USSR, Fidel Castro became a communist. He created a communist party. He announced his commitment to Marxist-Leninist ideology. But let me say that we knew very well that he never became an orthodox communist. let me remind you, as one example, about the attitude of the Cuban government toward the Catholic Church and toward religion. The isolation of Cuba was the main reason for the whole thing developing according to the logic of revolution, to the logic of endless, irreconcilable struggle in the context of hostility and mutual intolerance. A number of things happened, and a lot of cruelty happened. And I have to say that both sides did things, did certain things. We in the Soviet Union understood that. But this is all history. Although this is recent history, with all its mistakes and injustices and absurd things and bitterness, expulsions, jails. And let me also say this. An ordinary Russian citizen who is not familiar with behind-the-scenes political dealings cannot understand why Americans had a tolerant attitude toward people like Somoza, the so-called our son of a bitch, as Franklin Roosevelt called him, or Pinochet, or the Paraguayan dictator Stroessner, and why they so much dislike, to put it mildly, Fidel Castro as a person, as a leader. I never knew Pinochet, and I do not regret that I never knew him. But I have spoken with Castro many times, and I would say that our relationship was quite active and friendly. And let me assure you, he doesn't at all resemble the kind of monster as he's being depicted by the propaganda. Recently, I was told about an international conference that took place recently in Havana, Cuba, to discuss the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The conference was attended by many Americans, by former officials and military people who were involved in that dangerous episode. In a very friendly way, they participated in that conference, shared their experiences, and had a very good exchange with Russian and Cuban participants, and spent time together. This meeting is another proof that one can leave behind conflicts, that one can leave conflicts behind in history. The world has changed so much. Fidel Castro spent 3 days with the participants in that conference. He spoke many times. He was open to all kinds of contacts, and he behaved as an ordinary participant in that conference, with no prejudice against the Americans. This is just a detail to characterize that person, but I have many other such details. So let me tell you that there is something that's even more important. First of all, this is a person with a lot of pride and self-esteem, but he never, ever allows himself to not to keep his word, not to keep his word. He was always a reliable partner in international affairs. I can confirm that whatever he promised, whatever we agreed specifically and precisely, he always did, he always followed. And this I saw when we worked together on the international aspects of the situation in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Angola, Our negotiations were with the United States, but because Cuba was involved, we also were talking to the Cubans, and Fidel Castro supported all commitments, and he kept those promises. Also, bear in mind that all European and Asian leaders and Latin American leaders, most of them regard him as an interlocutor and a political partner with whom they can deal. The European countries, who have the same values of democracy as the United States, have a comprehensive political and economic relationship with Cuba, and recent worsening of those relations does not change that fact in principle. So it is becoming increasingly clear today that the time has come to change the relationship between Cuba and the United States. I am saying this because I am the person who was involved in the dialogue, who was involved in developing a new relationship between my country and the United States. This new relationship has affected the world. We have been able to close the book on practically all old conflicts. And in those discussions that we had with the President of the United States, we did mention Cuba. And I always said what I'm saying today. I don't want to interfere either in Cuban affairs or in American affairs, but I have the moral right to say what I am saying, and particularly to say this to you at this very important gathering where you are discussing this problem, which is of such importance for the United States and for international politics. So I believe that the relationship, the current relationship between Cuba and the United States are totally anachronistic. The changes that have occurred in the world in the past 20 years are truly remarkable. We have left behind the Cold War and the confrontation between two irreconcilable ideological systems, the symbol of divided Europe, the Berlin Wall, which Ronald Reagan famously urged me to tear down in 1987, has long since been destroyed. But one relic of the Cold War remains: the wall of the economic embargo imposed by the United States on Cuba 43 years ago. The lack of relations between the US and the Cuban government, enshrined as it is in the US policy of economic and diplomatic isolation of Cuba, has not allowed for an understanding that could benefit the citizens of both countries, of the United States and of Cuba. The burden of isolation of Cuba has been borne by ordinary citizens on both sides of the Florida Straits, the divided Cuban family. Very often, I had to respond to the various appeals of the President of the United States to help unification of divided families. When a part of that family lived in America and another part of that family in the Soviet Union, I received piles of letters from the President, from congressmen, etc., and we always helped. Here again, we have a divided family that we want to help at a time when the Cold War has ended, when the world is changing. That this current situation is abnormal and that the embargo policy is counterproductive is increasingly recognized throughout the world and in the United States. That's my impression. And in this context, I would like to recall the visit to Cuba of Pope John Paul II. This visit symbolized the willingness of the international community to open to Cuba and of Cuba to open to the world. Former President Jimmy Carter's trip to that country was also a significant development. Many other U.S. political leaders have spoken in favor of normalizing relations. And I think that the only way to get out of this anachronism, of this current time warp, is to replace the current U.S. policy with a policy of constructive engagement, similar to the one being pursued toward other so-called communist countries. This view is shared not only by most members of the international community, it has support among the most affected by the current policy, namely the Cuban people and the Cuban Americans in the United States. And I think that the continuation of the current policy damages is quite damaging to this country. If you look at it from the standpoint of real political leadership, it should have been done, lifting this policy should have been done a long time ago. I believe that the Cubans and Cuban Americans would benefit the most if the United States were to liberalize its policy, starting by opening the door to travel to Cuba. Let's remember that expanding contacts and exchanges agreed to by President Reagan and me at our 1985 summit in Geneva, very first meeting in Geneva, did very much to increase mutual understanding between our two countries. So you look at this issue from whatever side, it's amazing that this issue still exists. It's not right, it's not normal. Many Cuban Americans who traditionally backed punitive measures against Cuba are increasingly calling for dialogue between the two nations. Polls with which I became familiar show that most Cuban Americans would like to take the first steps to heal the wounds of the past 43 years. I think the leaders of both states should recognize that true courage is demonstrated by a willingness to engage in a difficult but honest dialogue, to admit mistakes and to seek common ground for the good of future generations. Recently, I believe that certain encouraging signs have emerged. You know, for example, that Cuba is cooperating with the United States on issues related to the jailing of Taliban in Guantanamo. You know that this was a very constructive step that made Cuba a member of the coalition against international terrorism. I have not heard that the United States has expressed its appreciation to Cuba for this decision of the Cuban government, for this position of the Cuban government, but this is very important. Also, a contract has been concluded for additional supplies of food to from the United States to Cuba. Meat is being delivered to Cuba, and that is a good thing. Tourism to Cuba is becoming a very prosperous industry, and the American Tourism Association is involved in that process. Congress has recently voted in favor of free travel to Cuba. If the president supports this decision, then during the very first year, as we know from surveys, 1 million Americans could visit Cuba, and soon that number would reach 5 million people a year. That would be a tremendously important development. The American National Council of the Churches of Christ is working to increase exchanges in culture and education. And of course, I've already mentioned Jimmy Carter's visit. I have read his letter to your summit. I believe that this is a wonderful letter. It is a very honest and a very candid and a very constructive letter. And I believe that it contains a number of important suggestions that your summit should bear in mind in trying to build a new relationship with Cuba. I am also familiar, and you, of course, also are familiar with the initiative of President Bush called New Cuba. Generally, we cannot yet speak about a breakthrough, but we can say that some things are being done, that there is movement in the right direction. When I read that Cuba initiative of President Bush, one can see that even though the political tone of that initiative is totally unacceptable to the Cuban leadership, there are some positive aspects in that initiative. And that means that the efforts of the Cuban people and the efforts of Cuban Americans have borne some fruit. Let me now mention another aspect. I know from my own experience that incomplete, selective, and particularly distorted information is extremely damaging and dangerous. I am saying this because it is my impression from what I know from the US media that the American public is not really well informed about what is happening in Cuba. In the Russian Academy of Sciences, we have the Institute of Latin American Studies. The scholars in that institute are studying Latin America as a whole and also specific countries such as Cuba. And when I was preparing for this trip, when I was preparing for this talk, I asked them to give me information about what's happening in Cuba. Today, Cuba has a record growth of gross domestic product, 8% a year. The factories that were built by Soviet engineers or with the help of the Soviet Union are again working at full scale, including in areas such as petrochemicals, mining industry, metals, pharmaceuticals, textile, sugar processing, energy, and also the production of agricultural equipment. It's very important that the Cuban economy is open to the world market, that there are no obstacles to international trade on the part of Cuba. Euro will soon become a free-floating currency in Cuba. Companies and banks from Canada, Japan, Germany, Spain, Italy, China, France, Holland, Mexico, Brazil form joint venture, and they invest tremendous amounts of money in different parts of the Cuban economy. And again, compared to that, the relationship between the United States and Cuba looks very odd. But the Cuban market, we see in the Cuban market American companies, General Motors, Ford, and Radisson. I was struck by one number, by one figure. It appears that foreign investment in Cuba is much higher than what foreign investors are investing in Russia. So this is amazing. This is really amazing that there is more foreign investment in Cuba than in that vast country, Russia. The Cubans are also expanding the exports of their traditional products and also of their new products. In managing their economy, the Cubans are obviously using the experience of China. And again, the amazing thing is that the United States has a tremendously active, intensive relationship with China, but not with Cuba. Double standard, that's what I call it, double standard. I don't know whether the Americans are aware of this growth in the Cuban economy. You probably know it, you who are sitting here in this room. But I think that this should be borne in mind by the policymakers when you discuss the prospects of relations between the United States and Cuba. I can see that there is a growing desire in America to change US-Cuban relations for the better, and the fact that you are meeting here for a second time in this summit conference, I believe, shows that there is this willingness to work for improvement. I believe that the time has come to develop a policy that would reflect new realities, a policy of constructive engagement with Cuba would make it possible not only to normalize relations between the two neighbors, but also to improve chances for an evolution in the domestic situation in Cuba, and also to create a different set of conditions for raising human rights issues. I believe that the embargo makes it possible for those who would like to preserve the authoritarian regime in Cuba to solidify their position. Imagine yourselves in Fidel Castro's shoes when your close neighbor is so very much against you. You have to mobilize because you never know what the northern neighbor would one day do or might one day do. I believe that the Cuban people are the least to blame for this current situation. Its vigor and tenacity and its ability to overcome difficulties and hardships really deserve respect and admiration. I have a lot of respect and admiration for the Cubans. I believe that the Cuban Revolution was a people's revolution. It was not imported from anywhere. So the first step is necessary. The first step that would start building a new relationship, a relationship that would be totally different from the one now. I believe that this first step should be made by the United States, a great country that can afford to act with respect, to act with understanding, that should make that first step. And I'm urging President Bush to take that first step, to break the wall of the embargo, to tear down that wall, to lay the foundation for a new relationship with Cuba, to make it possible for Cubans on both sides of the straits to extend a hand of friendship to each other. I believe that that should happen. I believe that the time for it is now. Thank you.
See if we can get this one. There it is. Mr. President, thank you. Now I'm starting to get your questions, and Lisa is going to collect them, if you would. They're starting to come in. Mr. President, if I could, I'll get to these questions. I think one that many people in this room would like to know your view on. President George W. Bush and his administration say, how can we take a first step towards normalizing relations just a few months after the Castro government has jailed 75 journalists and independent librarians and political dissidents simply for speaking out against the regime?
Ну, я думаю, можно было этот шаг сделать за 40 лет.
Well, I believe that this step could have been taken sometime during these 43 years.
А теперь, когда это произошло, вроде бы обречено все на продолжение.
Now that this happened a few months ago, does that mean that the embargo should continue forever?
Я думаю, даже и кубинцы бы отреагировали таким образом, что они бы пошли на то, чтобы эти люди вышли на свободу.
I believe that an end to the
Да мало ли
embargo
что может решить
could well
кубинское руководство,
result in
если
the
на такой шаг пойдут Соединенные Штаты Америки.
I believe that an end to the embargo could well result in the release of those people, and the Cuban government, I think, could do a number of things once the United States takes that first step and lifts the embargo.
Я уверен в этом.
Actually, I'm
Я
convinced.
уверен, что вот моя мысль о том, что первый шаг должны сделать, важный шаг, снять блокаду, должны Соединенные Штаты Америки.
I am convinced, I repeat, that the first step, the lifting of the embargo, that should be done by the powerful nation, by the United States of America.
И, кстати, это можно и предварительную подготовку провести. Но я уж не буду здесь заниматься технологией.
Perhaps
Это
this,
проблема американцев и кубинцев.
perhaps this step should be prepared in a certain way and discussed, but that is something that I will not go into the detail of because it is up to the Americans and the Cubans to see how this could be best done.
Подходящий момент.
The time is
Очень
good. The
подходящий.
time is right to do it.
Mr. Gorbachev, here's a question from Ken Lipner, who wants you to sign your book for him. He says, with your close understanding of the thinking of President Castro, do you believe that a perestroika can occur in Cuba?
Убежден, если будет снята блокада и Куба откроется для связей с другим остальным миром, то она будет развиваться в духе тех процессов, которые идут в мире.
I am
А в мире
convinced-
идут процессы трудно, болезненно, но идут процессы демократизации и утверждения права и свободы.
I am convinced that if the embargo is lifted and if Cuba becomes open to relations with all the other countries of the world, then developments in Cuba will go along the path that is now generally being followed in the world. In the world, generally, there is a process of democratization, and I believe that Cuba will be in that mainstream.
Но это будет переход.
This is a
Нелегкий,
transition. It has to be a
нелегкий.
transition. It cannot be an
как его
easy
осуществляет
transition.
и моя страна, и десятки других стран.
It hasn't been an easy transition for my country. It hasn't been an easy transition for dozens of other countries.
Поэтому всякие ультимативные требования, чтобы сегодня объявляем, послезавтра Куба стала уже другой, и кубинцы другими, это, по-моему, утопия.
And so any kind of ultimatum saying that we do something today and tomorrow Cuba should be a totally different kind of country, that kind of ultimatum will not work. It will not work anywhere, not just in Cuba.
Let me paraphrase this question, Mr. President. Generally, the questioner is asking, do you agree that it should be easier for United States citizens to travel to Cuba, and should Cubans be able to travel more freely out of Cuba?
Я думаю, безусловно, это то, что должно быть сделано уже давно.
I believe this is exactly right. I believe that freer travel is something that should have been done a long time ago.
Это, несомненно, должно быть сделано еще до главного шага.
And I believe that there is no doubt that this should be probably the step that should be taken even before the most important step.
Я не сомневаюсь.
And I have no doubt about that.
Mr. President, here's an interesting question about your country. How much does Russia today correspond to your vision of it in 1991? And had you been elected president in 1996, what would have been the most important initiative that you would have undertaken?
События после того, как распался Союз, и я прекратил свою деятельность на посту президента. Кстати, меня никто не освобождал, я прекратил свою деятельность. События пошли в другом русле и по другому сценарию. Эволюционный путь постепенных реформ, накопление опыта в функционировании демократических институтов, рыночной экономики и так далее, был заменен на такой кавалерийский наскок, на шоковую терапию, и это привело к тому, что неподготовленная страна оказалась открытой, и в конкуренции она сразу потерпела поражение.
After I stepped down as president of the Soviet Union and after the Union broke up, what happened was very different from the gradual, step-by-step evolutionary approach that I believed was good for our country. Instead of that approach, a rather reckless approach was chosen. Shock therapy was chosen as our economic policy. And as a result of that, our country was, even though it was not prepared for total openness to the international market, the Russian market was open, and because most of our industries were not competitive, they collapsed as a result of that reckless policy.
Теперь в России надо действовать, исходя из тех реальностей, которые уже сложились.
Today, Russia must act recognizing the realities that we are dealing with.
Переписать историю никому не дано.
You cannot rewrite history.
Но ориентиры остаются все-таки теми же. Это выбор в пользу свободы, демократии, открытости,
But the
рыночной
goals remain the
экономики.
same. The goals remain the same. Those are the goals of freedom, democracy, market economy, and openness.
Сейчас было важно преодолеть хаос, который возник в результате десятилетнего правления Бориса Ельцина.
The important immediate goal was to overcome the chaos that resulted from the 10 years of the rule of Boris Yeltsin.
Это в основном сделано в первый период правления Путина.
That has now
И
been
теперь
mostly done by President Putin during his first presidential term.
И теперь стоит задача модернизации страны.
And now our next task is modernization of our economy.
Образовательный, культурный, научный потенциал в России, к счастью, сохранился для того, чтобы такую задачу решать.
The educational, scientific, and cultural potential of Russia is still quite high and quite sufficient to address the task of modernizing our economy.
Природные ресурсы огромны.
And we have tremendous natural resources.
И я думаю, что в этот следующие 4 года деятельности нового парламента и президента как раз и решится судьба, каким будет Россия в ближайшее будущее.
And I believe that the coming 4 years after the parliamentary election this fall and after the presidential elections, I believe that the coming 4 years will be decisive in shaping the future of Russia.
Mr. President, what do you think of U.S. efforts to increase funding for dissidents in Cuba?
Да я думаю, надо снять эмбарго и стимулировать инвестиции на Кубу. Это самый лучший вариант.
Well, I think that what would really work best is not only lifting the embargo, but also stimulating U.S. investment in Cuba. That, I think, will work very well.
А стимулирование пятой колонны, это будет только лишь под подозрение ставить даже благие желания Соединенных Штатов.
If, however, the emphasis is on funding and stimulating dissidents, this might actually throw into question even the best intentions that the United States may have.
Я не хочу обидеть тех людей, которые там в условиях реальных действуют с оппозиционных позиций, выступают как демократы, но они будут поданы как та самая пятая колонна.
I really do not want to offend those people in Cuba who are trying to do something for democracy in that country in the current situation. But we should make sure that they are not seen as a kind of fifth column.
Mr. Gorbachev, here's a very good question. The lack of compensation for confiscated properties in Cuba is a sticking point in the negotiations that might lead to lifting the embargo. Based on your experiences in Europe, I guess particularly in East Germany, do you have any suggestions on how this issue could be resolved? Compensation for confiscated properties leading possibly to lifting the embargo.
Это предмет переговоров между администрацией США и правительством Кубы.
Well, I believe that this is something that should be negotiated by the governments, by the U.S. administration and the government of Cuba.
Там подведут баланс, и тогда видно будет, кто кому должен больше.
They should sit down and compute and make calculations, and I don't know who owes what to whom and who owes more.
Трудно сказать, какой баланс получится.
It's a little hard now to know what the balance is going to be.
Упущенные потери, упущенные выгоды, если посчитать от блокады, то,
Because
наверное, не хватит никакой недвижимости и собственности.
Because if you look at the disadvantages and if you look at the damage caused by the embargo, by the blockade, well, you don't know how that will balance out the other aspects.
Но это вопрос действительно администрации и правительства.
But again, this is to be negotiated. This is to be negotiated by the two governments.
Конгресс пусть работает.
And the Congress, too, will be involved, I'm sure.
Mr. President, how would you differentiate the Berlin Wall and the wall that you described? All right, I've got to find this one. This is a lighter question. They're not all that serious. Here it is. In the Wim Wenders movie, it showed you gazing out a window in Berlin, and the camera showed you very pensive, then you shed a tear. Why did you seem to be in conflict? Why did you shed that tear?
Это надо Вендерса спросить.
Well, you should ask Mr. Wenders.
Как они делают фильмы, это поразительно.
They make the movies. It's amazing.
Это очень талантливый человек.
She is a very talented person.
Я даже не знал, что я участвую в фильме.
Actually, I did not know that I was taking part in the filming.
Все.
That's it.
All right. Mr. President, a
Наш европейский Голливуд. Голливуд же все может.
He is like European Hollywood, and you know that Hollywood can do anything, everything.
Here's a question. What overriding interest should the Bush administration consider regarding Cuba? Many in the U.S. argue that we can afford to continue this current policy towards Cuba because there is no overriding interest to change it.
Нет, я думаю, есть интерес.
I believe
Я не
there
могу
is an
согласиться
interest,
с аргументацией, что нет
and I
никакого
cannot
интереса.
really agree that there is no overriding interest in changing this policy.
Если действует этот саммит, значит, есть интересы у людей здесь, И
And I think-
их беспокоит, и пренебрегать тем, что огромная масса людей это беспокоит, это, по-моему, не совсем демократично, по
And I
меньшей
think that the
мере.
very fact that this summit is taking place, that you have gathered here, that you are concerned, shows that there is a real interest on the part of the people in ending this current situation. And I believe that this interest on the part of the people should not be ignored.
Если большая страна так относится с безразличием к соседней стране и ко всему, что происходит там с людьми, то тогда возникает вопрос, какой пример она дает и почему она, о каком тогда лидерстве в мире может быть идти.
And also, I think that if such a great power as the United States is treating a small country, a small neighbor in this way, can this country really be a world leader? That's what I'm asking.
Надо бояться простых обсуждений и простых рецептов.
Of course,
Это большие вопросы.
on issues like this, there are no simple recipes, simple prescriptions.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. Here's a good one. Mr. President, how much money in dollars did the Soviet Union spend giving to Cuba between 1961 and 1989? And if it hadn't given that money, would spending it at home have hastened democracy?
Несомненно, это было бы полезно для нас.
Well, there is no doubt that saving that money and using that money for our own purposes would have been good for us, would have been useful for us.
Но теперь давайте зададим другой вопрос. И
But
сразу все станет
Let us
ясно.
now ask another question which will clarify
За
things.
годы Холодной войны в топку гонки вооружений Соединенные Штаты и СССР, каждый в отдельности, бросили по 10 триллионов долларов.
And that is how much money was used during the Cold War by the Soviet Union and by the United States for the arms race. And the answer is $10 trillion each.
Теперь десятки миллиардов мы тратим, господин генерал, на то, чтобы уничтожить это оружие.
And we are now using tens of billions of dollars, as General Sheehan knows, in order to destroy those weapons that we built during the Cold War.
Вот это и есть холодная война.
So that is the legacy
Ее
of the Cold War.
последствия.
That is the consequences of the Cold War.
Многое мы смогли решить проблем, если бы после войны продолжили традиции сотрудничества в борьбе с фашизмом. Они создали такое противостояние, которое было, весь мир поставило на грань конфликта, войны, ядерной угрозы.
We could have done a lot of good things, a lot of useful things, had we not had a Cold War after World War II, had we continued the cooperation that Russia and the United States had during World War II. Instead, we started a conflict, we started a confrontation that was extremely damaging, that caused a lot of damage to all of us.
А конгрессмены должны уже искать 87 миллиардов долларов сейчас срочно.
And by the way, Congress is now looking for $87 billion. It has to do it quickly.
Так что, знаете,
So that's what I can say.
это та тема, которая исчезнет тогда, когда мы поймем, что мы живем в одном мире, что нам нужно договариваться, вести диалог, принимать совместные решения и общими усилиями строить справедливый мир.
And I believe that this whole issue will look very differently once we understand that we live together in a very different world, that we have to work together to build a better world and a world that will be more just.
Как-то спросили Папу Римского, нужен ли новый мировой порядок и каким он должен быть.
His Holiness the Pope was once asked whether he believes in a new world order and what kind of
Его ответ
world
был
order
очень,
he believes in.
его ответ был очень кратким и содержательным.
And his answer was very succinct and very, very important.
Он сказал, нам нужен новый мировой порядок,
He said, we need a new world order,
и он должен быть более стабильным,
a world order that would be more secure,
более справедливым
more just,
и более гуманным.
and more humane.
А остальное это уже нам решать, политикам, бизнесменам, но я думаю, что он формулу выдвинул выдающуюся.
And I believe that this is the agenda for us, for all the political and business leaders, and I believe that this is a great agenda.
Спасибо.
Thank you.